Okay, hi. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, so today I want to start talking about the Tractatus. Give me a minute first. Yeah, so I want to talk about the Tractatus, and I think the sort of question that's sort of driving Wittgenstein is, how is it possible to think about the world? Like, here I am, here's the world, and I'm able to think about the external world. So how is it possible? How is it possible to think about the world? So you've got two things. You've got the world, you've got thought, and then the question is, yeah, how is it possible to have a thought that is somehow about something else? I think he's really interested in the problem of the sort of the possibility of representation. How is it possible for one thing to represent another? And he's particularly interested in thought. And he thinks thought essentially has something we might think of as like a linguistic structure. So the question about how is it possible to think about the world? Yeah, we might think, how is it possible to talk about the world? So how can sentences have meaning? How can thought have meaning? And the answer is that there needs to be some, and one thing about thought, I think any sort of adequate account of thought has to explain how we can sometimes misrepresent what's going on. And so first of all, we're able to think about the world, we're able to think about the way things are, but sometimes we make mistakes so that we represent the world in a way that is false. Yeah. So any account of the relationship between thought and the world has to leave room for misrepresentation. So sometimes we think about things in a way that is non-actual. Yeah, we have a thought that is meaningful, that has some meaningful content, but misrepresents the way the world is. And in my other class, I'm teaching Ruth Milligan, and I think she's got her sort of view, it ends up having a sort of Tractarian view. So I'm just going to read a sort of paragraph from her to show that this sort of Tractarian way of thinking about representation is still something that sort of people buy into. So she says, she's talking about the way language can be used to represent reality. And she says, there's no need to belabor this point here. In the present context, what really matters is that believing what one hears said is a way of picking up information about substances, about things in the world. And that is, it is by learning a language that a child is able to pick up information in this way. It sounds a bit queer to speak of learning a word for a substance. She's using queer in the old-fashioned sense. Yeah, this is even, yeah, she's an old lady, so she's allowed to. It sounds a bit queer to speak of learning a word for a substance as learning a way to identify that substance. But just as the relation of one part of the pattern on the television screen to another part can manifest the relation of one part of Dan Rather, the news presenter, to the other, the relation of a word to other words in a sentence can manifest the configuration of a substance in relation to other substances and properties in the world. So just as on a television screen, you can have, something moving, and you've got, say I'm on television, and there's my head and there's my arm. Yeah, and the movement of things on the television screen or the layout of things in the television screen can manifest something about the relationship between my body and my arm. That just as the relation of one part of the pattern on the television screen to another part can manifest the relation of one part of Lucas's body to another, the relation of a word to other words in a sentence can manifest a consideration of a substance in relation to other substance and properties in the world. Yeah. The semantics of natural languages is productive. Alterations performed on sentences correspond systematically to alterations in what the sentences represent, just as in the case of pictures, although the mapping functions involved are of course far more abstract. So in a picture, you have a mapping relationship between the picture and the thing pictured, and a change in the picture can correspond to a change in the thing pictured. Yeah, that we can have a similar mapping relationship between language and reality, except the mapping functions involved are of course far more abstract. Yeah. Now, I take it that what Milligan just explained there is pretty much the view of meaning that you get in the Tractatus. Yeah, it's an updated of this view of the Tractatus. So in the Tractatus, here's the handout. This is the Tractatus is written in a really weird way. You have a bunch of numbered sentences. There are 7 of them, and then you have like 1.1 and 1.11. Yeah, it has a sort of it has a sort of 1.11, 1.112. It has this sort of tree structure. So the kind of big picture is supposed to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then within it it goes 1.1, 1.2, or 2.1, 2.2. If anyone's interested, that Wittgenstein died long enough ago so that his works have now entered the public domain. And on Twitter, they just posted they've got a translation of the Tractatus, organized, a free one, organized like a tree. So you can kind of explore it in this kind of tree-like way. If anyone's interested, just have a look on Twitter. So we have these sections, and that we can divide it up, I think, into 3 sections. We have a discussion of the world. That's the first thing. We then have a discussion of pictures. Yeah, how pictures work, how the picturing relationship works. And then we have a sort of discussion of short sentences. Think about it in German is Satz, and Satz, which is a sentence, can either be translated as sentence or proposition. Right? Sort of a proposition. And the sort of big claim is that the way in which sentences represent the world, the way in which the language represents the world, is entitled to. So if we understand how this sort of picturing relationship works, how a build works, this allows us to understand how language can represent the world. And one thing about picturing is that in order for a picture to work, there's got to be some common form between the picture and the thing pictured. Yeah. And the common form is both the picture and the thing pictured are spatial. So the picture and the thing pictured share a sort of spatial form. And it's the fact that they have the same form that allows the picturing to work. Now, in order for language to represent the world, there's got to be some shared form, but the form is not going to be spatio-temporal. It's going to be logical. Yeah. So, and it's going to turn out that given this theory of language, given the fact that language works through picturing, it turns out that we can't say anything about logical form. So it's going to turn out that everything that says about logical form turns out to be nonsense. Yeah, because it's something that can't be said. Because logical form is not something that can be pictured. Logical form is what makes picturing possible. Yeah, it's what makes linguistic picturing possible. But it itself cannot be pictured. It's a condition for the possibility of picturing. And that means that in some sense, everything he said about logical form turns out to be nonsense given his own account of meaning. But he thinks that my reading of Wittgenstein is he thinks that we can use language to show things. Yeah, and so the logical form is something that we can't say something about it, we can't depict it, but we can use language to kind of show something. Yeah, and I think what he said about logical form. So up until here, I think it's quite easy to make sense. Then there's a kind of jumbled mess where he introduces the semantics for propositional logic. So he introduces the idea of truth tables, and there's a whole bunch of logic stuff. And then towards the end, it all gets a bit mystical. And so he has some stuff about the I. So it turns out the I is not a part of the world. Yeah, that I am not an object in the world. And so in some sense, the I, and I think we might think the I and both going to have similar type of statements. They're gonna be something like conditions for, I mean, this is my Kantian background you can hear coming through. They're going to be conditions for the possibility of picturing, of saying, but they're not things themselves that can really be named. So the I is not named. Now, and so last time when we talked about logical form, I read the final quote from Russell, and I'm just going to read it again. I just want to, in case you missed it, I think it's useful just to. So he said, this is Russell. He says, in every proposition and in every inference, there is a certain form, a way in which the constituents of the proposition or inference are put together. If I say Socrates is mortal, Jones, so we've got Socrates is mortal, Jones is angry, the sun is hot. We've got these three sentences. There is something in common in these three cases, something indicated by the word is. What is common is the form of the proposition, not an actual constituent. This form is not another constituent, but is the way in which the constituents are put together. So in each case, we can kind of replace the constituents with a variable. So here we say x is y. X, where f is a variable for a property, x is a variable for an individual. And we can do the same question. You can say today, I mean, we might think that the form of a subject predicate judgment is fx. form of a two-place relation, Rxy. I think today we would write that Rxy, where these are all kind of variables. And Russell thinks that in order to understand any sort of judgment, one needs to kind of understand the logical form. And logical form is something that one must be acquainted with. One must have a concept of predication. One must have a concept of a relation. One must in some sense have a grasp of this. And this is something that Wittgenstein was like, hold on, that doesn't make any sense. So one of the things Wittgenstein's trying to do is to offer an account of logical form. The logical form is something that can be shown, but it can't be said. And I suggested that understanding Wittgenstein's account of meaning is that you came to think that when we talk about pictures, we could also, people talk about the picture theory of meaning. Another way of thinking about it, I think, is something like the model theory of meaning. That a sentences are models of the world. Now, this is what he's thinking. And I think the two things that really influenced him were he read a short article about the court case in Paris, and they basically reconstructed an accident in the courtroom using a model. So they had two cars here, and then they had the passenger, and then they tried to say what was going on, and you had different accounts of what happened, different models, only one of which was true. So here we've got one thing representing another. We have the actual accident as an event in the world, and then we have the model in the courtroom. And bits of the model correspond to bits of the world, and changes in the model correspond to potential changes in the world, possible changes in the world. So you've got this is Lucas, this is Zubeda. Suppose we had a crash. Who crossed over first? Here's a traffic light. I don't know. Yeah, we could kind of say one person could claim it was like this, another person could claim it was like this. So we've got two different configurations of the model, which correspond to two possible ways the world could be. He was also influenced by Friedrich Hertz. Anyone heard of Hertz? Anyone from engineering? Or Hertz is what? Yeah, didn't he? Electricity. Yeah. And so here's a quote that I've got on the handout. So this is from his Principles of Mechanics from 1894. And remember that Wittgenstein was trained as an engineer. So we're talking about the relationship between a model and the thing model. We've got a dynamic model. So a dynamic model is a kind of structure that can change over time. Yeah, so you've got, yeah. And he said the relation of a dynamic model of the system to the system of which it is regarded the model is precisely the same as the relation of the pictures which our mind forms of things to the things themselves. Yeah? For if we regard the condition of the model as the representation of the condition of the system, then the consequence of this representation, which according to the laws of this representation, are also the representation of the consequence which must proceed from the original object according to the laws of this original object. So suppose you've got some model here of the world. Now, I mean, so let's say in the model, you move, you've got a model ball and a real ball. Yeah. The model, in the model, this ball hits this one and this one bounces off here. Now, if it's a good model, we've got the model of the two balls. Then, as this one moves here, this one will go here. So a change, insofar as a model is a good model, a change in the model will predict a change in the thing modeled. Yeah? So if in the model this ball hits this one at this angle and it flies off like this, if it's a good model, then if we have the same move in the reality, then we'll find the same consequence in reality. Yeah. So the agreement between the mind and nature may therefore be likened to the agreement between two systems which are models of one another. And we can even account for this agreement by assuming that the mind is capable of making actual dynamic models of things and of working with them. Yeah, so the relationship between thought and reality, can be understood in terms of the relationship between a model and the world. And I think this is basically the idea that Wittgenstein takes, this sort of picture theory of meaning. Yeah. This is the kind of picture of meaning that Wittgenstein then goes on to reject in the investigations. If we have time, I might, if I can finish the Tractatus quickly enough, I might then throw in some stuff, criticism of the Tractatus from the later Wittgenstein, so we can see what Wittgenstein tend to see was wrong with this way of thinking about language, and how language works. Yeah. So this is the story. So he starts off, he's interested in offering you the account of the way in which thoughts, language can be about the world. And the argument is that language somehow pictures reality. Now, with a kind of picture, we can see how this works. So, or a film, we can understand how a picture can be a picture of something, and we can understand how relations in the picture can correspond to relations in the world. Yeah, so, suppose you've got a picture of a bunch of students. Yeah, that in the picture you've got a bunch of things that represent the individual students, and then you might think, well, if one student is between, if I am between Zubaydah and Sun in the picture, that means if the picture of Lucas is between the picture of Zubaydah and Sun in the picture, that means that in reality, Lucas is between Zubaydah and Sun. That's the sort of idea. So the way in which things stand to each other spatially in the picture, insofar as the elements of the picture correspond to elements in the world, the spatial relations between the elements in the picture corresponds to the actual spatial relations between the things represented. Yeah, so we can see how picturing sort of works. And it sort of works. Now, Wittgenstein's sort of thought is that language works in a similar way, but the sort of relations are not logical relations. They're more complex relations. Now, I think one thing about Wittgenstein is that in the language Wittgenstein's introducing, we can't talk about logical form. Yeah. But you might think, hold on a minute, we can just have another language. We can have some sort of meta language in which we can talk about logical form. Yeah. So it seems to me that you might think, okay, he's offering an account of a particular aspect of language or a particular part of language. Maybe in the language that Wittgenstein is describing, it's not possible to name logical form in this language. But then we can just take a step outside, and then we have another language that includes this language as something in the world. I think that's the way to go. We can just say, well, we've got Wittgenstein's language. That's something that exists in the world. And then we can have another language that is a sort of meta language that can look at the relationship between Wittgenstein's language and other bits of the world. And yeah. So I'm not so worried about Wittgenstein about what cannot be said. So this is the sort of story. What time is it now? Okay, 25. So I'm going to try and start looking at the first Who started reading the Tractatus? I know we're coming up to break. If I was you, I would get all my stuff done and then read the Tractatus over the break. So if you haven't started yet, that's fine. And it's not very long. You know, it's only a few. You know, it's really short. It's only 7 sentences. Yeah, it's not huge. I tried to summarize what I take to be the highlights of the first 3 sections. So let me just read through and so the world. What is the world? So he says the world is all that is the case. Yeah, the world is the totality of facts, not things. Yeah. What is a fact? A fact is the existence of the state of affairs. Yeah, so we've got the notion of a state of affairs, and then we've got the notion of a fact. And a fact is a particular type of state of affairs. A fact is a state of affairs so a state of affairs can either exist or not exist. Yeah. So a state of affairs can either exist or not exist. So you think about it. So let's just think we've got a list of all the possible states of affairs. The list of the state of affairs is all of the ways the world could be. And then there's the way the world is. So facts are the way the world is. The world as it is a collection of facts. And the world is a totality of facts, not things. And what is the case of fact is the existence of a state of affairs. And I take it that the sum total of all the states of affairs is the sum total of everything that's possible. Yeah, so in some sense, this distinction between states of affairs and facts is a distinction between the possible and the actual. Yeah. What exists in the state of affairs? So what is actual is possible, but we've got a whole bunch of ways the world could have been that it's not. Yeah? So what is a state of affairs? So when we're asking what a state of affairs is, we're offering an account of possibility, what's possible. Yeah? So a state of affairs or a state of things is a combination of objects. Yeah. The state of affairs is a combination of objects. Now, what sort of objects are there? Now, I think that objects, when it comes to listing what objects there are, that we've got particulars, properties, and maybe relations. Let's say we've got particulars, properties, and relation. That coming from Ross. Yeah. Remember that these are all things that we could potentially be acquainted with. Take it these are kind of the possible objects of acquaintance. Now he then says, in logic, nothing is accidental. if a thing can occur in a state of affairs, the possibility of the state of affairs must be written into the thing itself. So if a thing can occur in a state of affairs, the possibility of this state of affairs must be written into the thing itself. So suppose we've got, just think of, let's suppose we've got happy, being happy. Yeah, and then let's suppose we've got Lucas and Sweden. So we've got, in our world, we've got three things, three objects. We've got Lucas, we've got Zabadi, and we've got is happy. Yeah, and so it's written into Lucas, yeah, that Lucas could be happy or not. Yeah, it's written into Zubaydah that Zubaydah could be happy or not. And it's written into being happy that Lucas could be happy or Zubaydah could be happy. Yeah, so in some sense, for properties, it's written into the property that all the objects could have this property. Now, one thing is that is happy is not very good because this table can't be happy or not happy. Yeah, it's not the sort of thing that can be happy or not happy. I take it Wittgenstein thinks that in this idea of the world, this is going to be the sort of world of science. Any individual can potentially have any property, and any property can potentially be had by any individual. Yeah. So we've got these properties, and we've got these individuals, and we've got these relations, and it's written into the properties that they're the properties of potentially any individual. And it's written into the individuals that they can potentially have any property. This is the idea. And this obviously doesn't work. Yeah, and you might think that Wittgenstein thinks that any combinations of properties is potentially possible. So the properties, the fact that an individual has one property can't exclude it from having another property. And I think the first worry Wittgenstein had in the 1920s that undermined his earlier this Tractatian view was about the synthetic a priori, yeah, and in particular about colors. So the fact that something is green sort of excludes it being red. Yeah, you got a point. And the Wittgenstein wants to treat all these properties as sort of distinct from one another. So basically, you gave the word of a set of properties and a set of individuals, and then the state of affairs is all the possible combinations of the properties and individuals. Yeah, and then the way the world actually is one configuration. Right? You think about the objects, and the objects are going to be properties, particular properties and relations. And any object can have any property and can stand in any relation to any other. And that gives you all the possible ways things could be. And then the way things actually are is one of these configurations. Yeah. So in logic, nothing is accidental. If a thing can occur in a state of affairs, the possibility of the state of affairs must be written into the thing itself. If I know an object of things that we know, this is very Russellian. These objects are possible objects of acquaintance. I take it that I think Wittgenstein in the background here is something like sense data theory, that the only real objects are kind of, you might think of as points. Yeah, and the properties are going to be kind of a little rep patch. Then you have relations. So if I know an object, I also know all its possible occurrences in states of affairs. And you might think, well, in order to know one object, then you must know all the objects. Yeah. If you know an object, you must know all the possible properties it could have. If you know an individual, you must know all the possible properties it could have. Every one of these possibilities must be part of the nature of the object. Now, given this account of objects, then we get the idea that if all the objects are given, then at the same time, all possible states of affairs are also given. So just by having a list of all of the objects, this gives you a sort of list. This lets you know all the ways things could be. Because possibility is just understood in terms of the various ways that objects can be configured. Like you've got three objects. Let's suppose you've got three objects, and then you've got A, B, C, and then you've got to the left of. Yeah, you have some ordering. So you can have A, B, C, you can have A, C, B, you can have B, A, C, you can have C, A, B, you can have B, C, A, you can have C, B, A. So let's suppose you've got three individuals, and then the only relation is going to be a sort of ordering relation, before-after relation. And then this will give you 6 possible configurations. That gives you the sort of possibility space. Yeah?
What can we just discover a new set of pairs? And then we can just give different properties to known objects. Like we can discover a new flavor that we haven't discovered before.
Yeah. So in this Wittgensteinian world, all novelty is reconfiguration. So there's no real novelty. It's a pretty boring world because the only novelty is reconfiguration. The only sort of novelty is just, you've got the objects, and then the only differences can be like how they're related, how they're kind of shuffled around. Yeah, so you've got objects, you've got all the possible configurations of objects, and then all change is just, so in this Wittgensteinian picture of the world, all change is reconfiguration. Now, Wittgenstein was quite religious and mystical. Yeah. So when this world isn't in some sense all there is, but this is the world insofar as it can be grasped with thought, insofar as it can be understood, insofar as we can talk about it. Yeah. And so insofar as we're able to grasp the world with thought, this is all there is. This is the world of science. Yeah, this is the world insofar as it can be grasped by a sort of scientific language, by a representational language. But then Wittgenstein thinks that everything that's important can't be grasped by science. That's the logical positivist about, well, like, oh great, this is all there is. Wittgenstein is like, well, yeah, you're not going to find the I in this world. Yeah, the poetry of music, in some sense, are doing something that shows you something that isn't sayable. Yeah, but insofar as the world is understandable, this is all there is. There can be no real novelty. Now, I think what's going to be the problem, and of course there can be conceptual novelty. Yeah, and that There can be certain types of emergence. There's no room in this universe for emergence. All you've got is a bunch of, you might think that at some level, I said that one way of interpreting Wittgenstein is the world, the objects are all going to be understood in phenomenological terms, in terms of sense data in this Russellian way. We might think, though, that this is the world that is going to be revealed to us in our final physics. Yeah, so Lamarck thought you could go both ways. You could either start off with a kind of world understood as a construction out of sense data, or you can have this world as it is understood by our final finished theory. And our final finished theory is just going to say, well, you've got a bunch of particles, and these particles can have various properties. And then, once you've got the theory, you, at least in principle, know all the possible ways the world could be. Yeah, because like for each, I don't know, in each point in the array, yeah, it can have a certain value. Yeah, and that gives you a full description. Yeah, well, what we're interested in is what would a full description, and once again, I'm moving from talking about the world to talking about a description of the world. So this is the world insofar as it's describable. Yeah. Now this so the possibility of it occurring in states of affairs is the form of an object. Yeah, so objects have a form. And the form of an object is its possibility of appearing in a state of affairs. So the form of happy is that it can be combined with Lucas, it can be combined with Zubeda. The form of Zubeda is that it can be combined with is happy. It can be combined with is next to Lucas. Zubeda is between Lucas and Sun. Yeah. But Zubeda is the sort of thing that can be combined in these ways. Yeah. And it's happy. The way, and it's going to turn out that kind of, then sometimes we can divide properties from individuals because of the way in which they can be combined. So we can't, like, we can't. Well, I would say we can't combine Lucas and Zubeda. Yeah, but Lucas Zubeda is not a possible state of affairs. Lucas being next to Zubeda is. Yeah, Lucas being happy is a possible state of affairs. Lucas being next to Zubeda, but Lucas Zubeda is not a possible state of affairs. With is happy, Lucas is happy is a possible state of affairs. Zubeda is happy is a possible state of affairs, but is tomorrow is happy is not a possible state of affairs. Yeah, so the possibility of it occurring in a state of affairs is the form of an object. And remember, I'm not using this language now, but I think it's going to turn out that we can kind of distinguish objects into particular properties and relations. So there are these different types of objects. And what makes them different, the fundamental difference between individuals and properties, has got to do with the way that they can be combined together. A property can be combined with an individual, but a property can't be combined with a property, and an individual can't be combined with an individual. Lucas is not a possible state of affairs. Lucas is happy is a possible state of affairs. Yeah. Now, so we've got this idea of the possibility of it occurring in a state of affairs form of an object. Now we're talking about, let's stop talking about the world, let's talk about our representation of the world. So he says in 2.022 that it's obvious that an imagined world however different it may be from the real world, must have something, a form, in common with it. So in order to represent something, there's got to be something in common between the representation and the thing represented. There's got to be, what's going to be this thing in common that makes representation possible is going to be the form. Yeah? And objects are just what constitute this unalterable form. Yeah, because objects are things that can be combined with others. And it's this possibility of combination that is the form of the object. And it's the form of the object that makes representation possible. Because in some sense, the representation has to share some form. Yeah, so I think I've said all of this, but I'll just read these quotes. So objects are what is unalterable and subsistent. So, you know, we've got these individuals. Well, are they points in space-time? I don't know what individuals are, but he doesn't tell us. And then we've got possible values the individuals could take. So let's think of kind of the individuals as points, and then these points can just have values. They can have some. Think about Sun. I'm thinking about Sun because I'm going to meet him after class for a beer. But Sun likes this sort of what's he called? Crazy Australian David Lewis type picture, where you just, you know, you've got this Humean supervenience. You've just got all these points, and each point can have a certain color, let's say. That's all there is. You've just got an array, every point and the world is basically a set of pixels. They're the individuals, and these pixels can have a certain color. Yeah, they can have a certain value. Yeah, and then for we can think of each of these points as not connected to the other one. And then let's suppose we've just got a black and white world. Each pixel can either be 0 or 1, black or white. Yeah, and then the ways the worlds could be would be just all the possible ways the world would be each point can either be black or white. Yeah, so there are two, you know, just think of, you know, yeah, it's all combinatorics. So the points, they're not the points and the properties are not changeable. There is no novelty there. And when you're talking about novelty, yeah, the objects of what are unalterable and subsistent. There are no change in the real individuals. There's no change in the possible properties. What can change? All change is a change in configuration. The configuration of the objects is what changes. Yeah, and the configuration of objects produces states of affairs. The states of affairs are the realm of possibility, and the possible is this sort of sum total of all the possible configurations of states of affairs. Yeah, so that's the world. And I mean, is it the mind independent world? I'm not sure it is, because you know, the limits of our world are the limits of our language. So this world is the world insofar as it can be represented, a world insofar as it can be thought. Insofar as the world can be represented in thought, insofar as the world can be thought, this is the way the world must be. Insofar as the world can be represented linguistically. So, what time is it now? 49. Okay, so that's a good place to stop, because we've talked about the world. And then, I mean, I think having heard this, you can probably sort of guess how the rest of it works. Like not all of it, because I think one thing that's going to be interesting is we've got particular properties and relations, but then we have logical operators. And I think his account of logical operators is interesting because to the left of, I think, is a relation, and that's an object. But logical operators are not names. We might think that Lucas and Adam are names. One's the name of an individual, the other's the name of a property, but not and or are not names. Yeah, so we've got particular properties and relations, and then we're going to have names for particular properties and relations in our language. But then we also have logical operators, and logical operators are not names. They're operators. Yeah, and he's going to offer an account of how we can make sense of logic in a way that fits in with this sort of picture. Yeah, because and, or, and not are not names. And he introduced the idea of a logical operator. I think this is kind of yeah. Okay, so for next class, I guess at the very least read the handout. But you've got the break. Try and read the Tractatus. After about 3, get all into logic. And I really like this stuff. I think it's really interesting. If you like logic, try and work through it. But if you're not that interested in the philosophy of logic, just skim through it. And then it sort of gets interesting towards the end, where we get mystical stuff, where we get his stuff about the eye. Yeah, and I think that's sort of fun. It's the more sort of Schopenhauerian side of Wittgenstein, the sort of mystical, the sort of mystical side. And that's the side, I think that's why he didn't like the logical positivists so much, because they took this and just went with it. And he's like, no, that's not the point. I'm interested in the stuff that can't be said. Yeah. I think this view is quite attractive, because I think it's a very natural way of thinking about representation. I think Wittgenstein is sort of right to see the sort of limitations of this sort of approach. Okay. Bye-bye.